Okay, so in the last video, I spoke about the ABCs of higher self-feedback versus survival intelligence feedback. In this video, we're going to go more into depth, specifically addressing your higher self-feedback and how you can come to befriend this feedback and identify it. So the acronym we're working with here is intelligence. So let's begin with I. Your higher self-feedback is inclusive. So having information about both your inner and outer world and having information about your specific needs, right? Your whole person needs. The feedback from higher self seeks to harmonize inner world need with outer world opportunity and resources. Okay, so you're not going to deal with, we talked about this in the last video, but the reason why higher self doesn't speak with polarizing language is because it is inclusive in nature and it doesn't work within the laws of necessarily polarity and duality. Or maybe it's better to say it's not limited by the laws of polarity and duality. It is inclusive in nature. And the next letter is going to be N, which is negotiable. So your higher self feedback is always going to negotiate with all the different parts of you. So let's say you have a business decision to make and there's a part of you that's really scared to pull the trigger and another part of you that is ready to go. Your higher self feedback is going to come to you, usually in a series of steps that are going to lead you to the path of least resistance, so as to harmonize all parts and get all parts on board for whatever the need that is trying to be satisfied is, right? To get that need met. So I like to think of it as like your sort of higher self scavenger hunt, right? So your higher self does negotiate with all the parts of you, and again is looking to harmonize and to sort of revisit what I said before. It's again why it doesn't feed into polarization between other internal parts of you. So in other words, your higher self is always ready and willing to pivot in order to include and in order to get you to a place of feeling open and receptive to the resources that are available to suit your needs. So the next letter, T, it stands for timed. So your higher self feedback arrives in the present moment. It is always timed. Now, typically speaking, we receive this guidance when we're immersed in our sensory experience. So in our experience here and now, when we're focused on sight, sound, touch, taste, we'll receive these insights. Now, I want to make a point about our higher self feedback being timed that I think is really important, because in the next video, we're going to talk a lot about our blocks to higher self and how we come to distrust higher self. And in my experience working with people, I have worked with many people who begin to distrust their intuitive guidance from higher self because at one point in time they made a decision based off of what they thought was higher self guidance, right? It felt like an intuitive yes. And maybe this was a relationship decision or maybe a career choice, and it didn't pan out. Or at least didn't pan out the way they thought it would, right? The person that they thought was the one ended up not being the one, right? Or the job that they thought was the dream job ended up, right? They ended up getting fired from it down the road. So I want to make a point about higher self being timed. So your higher self, though it's not limited by time, it takes time into account, and it has to, because what it's doing is it's surveying what's happening in our inner and outer world in any moment. So where you are with regards to what your specific needs are in any moment, your higher self knows. Okay, and it also knows what resources are available in your outer world in any moment in time. So there might be cases where you were led to certain decisions, where higher self led you to make a certain decision based off of what it knew about you, what your needs were, also what it knew about the different parts of your personality and how on board or how ready they were to participate in, acquiescing or getting this need met, as well as what resources were available in your outer world at the time the decision needed to be made. Okay, so having decisions not work out the way that we thought they would is not a failing of higher self. It's reflective of, again, where we are, how we're unfolding into ourselves, how we're growing and changing, and how our needs grow and change, as well as what resources are available in the present moment in time that we're making the decision. So the next characteristic is E, evolving. So I mentioned before earlier that I like to think about higher self feedback as a scavenger hunt. And oftentimes we get clues along the way, especially when it comes to the deepest desires or needs that we hold. So we might be led to a person who sparks an idea, but maybe that idea, and maybe this is for like a business venture, maybe the resources aren't queued up yet in our outer world. And so we are led to another person that sparks another idea or a call to action in a certain way, right? So higher self is always working and evolving in its feedback as we evolve, as our needs evolve, and is also evolving with regards to the plan itself, based off of what resources are available in the here and now. And based off of any internal resistance that we might have. This relates back to the idea of higher self-feedback being negotiable and inclusive, right? It seeks to harmonize us and get us behind whatever the action step may or may not be, which means that, right, like it works within our resistance, which means it will often lead us to a series of steps or phases in order to get needs met, rather than, like leading us to the ultimate desire itself, because there may be internal resistance to the things that we want most in life and that we feel that we need most in life. And so through this evolved feedback and these series of steps, we become not only more confident in higher self to resource our needs, so we build confidence in higher self, which then allows us to reduce inner resistance from any other parts of ourselves that might be fearful of what it is that we want. Okay, so this is how this evolved feedback works. It actually helps us to continue to lean into higher self and to trust its leadership over time, which allows us to access more and greater needs. So something I'll usually tell family and friends is I like to think about higher self feedback in these two terms. So with regards to how it delivers feedback to us, I think higher self delivers us both models and options. Our models are sort of the clues that we get along the way. It's the people, places, and things that spark something in us that resonate with deep inner needs that we might have. And our options are the people, places, and things that really fulfill the whole of our survival and ecstasy needs. The reason that higher self will use evolved feedback to lead you to models versus options is because for many of us, we have internal resistance to the things that we want the most. We're afraid of what we really, really want, of what we feel we really, really need. And so we need steps and phases, and we need to have certain experiences to slowly expand ourselves, our cognitive models, so that we can, and these parts of ourselves that are afraid, right, to make them feel safer incrementally, so that we can receive more of the whole of our needs, okay? And so that we can receive our options. And our options are, again, those people, places, and things that really satisfy the whole of who we have evolved into and the whole of our needs at current. And again, through this evolved feedback and leaning into the scavenger hunt, we develop greater trust along the way of for higher self, so that when those options arrive, we don't miss them because we take the cue. Okay, we've built the confidence, we lean into life, we lean into these options, and we get the whole of our needs met. Okay, so the next characteristic is L, localized. So creative intelligence or outer world intelligence is non-localized, meaning it's non-focused. If we were to refer back to the sun analogy, the creative intelligence of the universal intelligence, you could say, is non-local. And the rays are localized, they're focused points. So your higher self intelligence, its point of focus is your inner world, but it's also connected to outer world intelligence. The next characteristic is another L, and this is limitless. So because your higher self has access to creative intelligence and the resources available in our outer world, it is it is limitless, right? It is limitless because it's connected to this creative power source. So the next characteristic is I, which is kind of self-explanatory, but your higher self is insightful. It knows about you. It's constantly dropping sort of nuggets of wisdom and information about you and about your needs to you. And as I said earlier, typically speaking, we receive these nuggets of information when we are fully engaged in our sensory experience, when we are receptive to the moment. If we go back to Lisa Miller's Awakened Brain and we're toggling back and forth between achieving awareness and awakened awareness, right? We create that doorway for our questing awareness to communicate to us, right? But in order to do that, we need to be receptive to the moment. We need to be in awakened awareness states. The next characteristic is higher self is generous. So what I mean by that is your higher self is non-conditional, right? It is unconditional. It wants to make itself known to you, right? We just need to remove the blocks to hearing higher self. But just like we don't need to earn electricity, we just need to know the laws and we need to know how to use it. Similarly, when it comes to higher self feedback, we don't earn this feedback. It's generous in nature. It wants to give, it wants to provide. So we don't have to will it. So the next characteristic is E, energetic. What I'm talking about here is really how higher self feels to us. How do we feel it in the body? How do we notice it when we're under the influence of higher self when it comes to our thoughts, right? In our mind? Like, what is the difference between your everyday sort of internal chatter and banter and when you receive an insight? You know, for me, it feels like sort of like a feather floating in my mind when I get a drop of, when I get a nugget of wisdom, right? And oftentimes when I track people's internal sensations when it comes to receiving higher self, what you'll hear is their body enters into this almost energetic state of willingness versus willfulness. So they might notice muscles start to loosen. They feel a greater sense of ease or lightness or a sense of calm in the body. Or a greater sense of flow in the body. But usually there is a specific cadence and a specific sensory experience, an energetic sensory experience that we are accustomed to having when we are under the influence of higher self. The next characteristic is your higher self is nurturing. So I talked about this in the ABCs in the previous video, but typically speaking, your higher self, the voice of your higher self is going to be very loving, even adoring. I know for me, one of the ways that I connect to higher self best is through writing. So my higher self actually sounds lyrical a lot of times, poetic at times, but usually and generally like always nurturing. The feedback is always nurturing. And typically speaking, we feel a greater sense of ease when we receive this feedback. The next characteristic is confident. So higher self feedback can be calming, which I talked about just before and also in the ABCs. It can also be very confident. When you're under higher self leadership and you're really tapping in, we tend to feel more sure of ourselves. We tend to lean into life more. We tend to be braver. So the feedback that we're getting, though it can be, like I said, lyrical and poetic and very adoring, can also come in pretty direct. Never judging and never polarizing, but it can come in very direct and simple. The final characteristic is E, easeful. So when we are under the governorship or the leadership of higher self, typically speaking, even if we have, a lot of tasks to do, or we're in the middle of working, or maybe we're involved in an athletic pursuit, we tend to feel easeful. There's a sense of flow in what we are doing when we're in questing brain states, or flow states, what positive psychologists call flow states, and we're accessing higher self. So even though, again, you might be getting things done, there is a sense of ease. And maybe even if the task is somewhat challenging, there is this sense of ease. There's this sense of flow. There is this sense of calm alertness that we feel when we're engaged with our here and now and the task at hand. So in the next video, we're going to get into blocks to higher self. And I'm also going to engage you in story time, where we're going to talk about how higher self came to be. Essentially, I'm going to provide you an origin story to understand your survival intelligence better and higher self better with regards to you, where you can personalize some of this information and start to address your own blocks down the road.